Hi, viewers and listeners. Thanks very much for joining us for another episode of Foreign Entanglements. As always, I'm your host, Natalie Sambhi, coming to you from Perth, Western Australia. Today, we'll be talking a little bit about Southeast Asia and the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. And joining me today is Research Fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney, Aaron Connelly. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Nat. Nice to see you.
Aaron, as always, we always like to kick off with a little bit about our guests. You're obviously an American in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? How did you come to look at Southeast Asia, and tell us a little bit about your journey?
I initially started out working on Japanese politics, and this was in the Koizumi era, and I was focusing on the DPJ and whether or not Japan would ever become a two-party system. And at some point in 2005, Koizumi won a two-thirds majority in the lower house of parliament and really destroyed the DPJ, and it seemed like they would never come back. And I said, I want to work on a more interesting, dynamic, unpredictable part of the world, and that part of the world ended up being Southeast Asia. Of course, 5 years later, the DPJ comes to power in Japan, so sometimes when you go from one line to another line in an effort to try and get to your destination faster, you end up a little bit behind. But I'm very happy working on Southeast Asia because it is so complex, so different, and so challenging to understand, and so diverse. You have countries like Indonesia, which are big, bustling democracies. Of course, you have countries like Cambodia, which is effectively a dictatorship. And so, I think there's a lot of very interesting variation in the region as well.
And you've spent a little bit of time in Indonesia as well?
That's right. I was a research fellow or I guess a visiting fellow at CSIS, the other CSIS in Jakarta, and I've also worked at CSIS in DC on Indonesia. I studied Indonesian in Jogja, which was a nice way to spend the financial crisis and set up the financial crisis back in 2008.
Definitely. I could think of worse ways. Now, just to give some of our listeners and viewers an idea, what are your first impressions of Indonesia? What can you really tell them about that place?
I think, the thing that headlines every briefing memo that is handed to a visiting official in Indonesia, you have a few demographic stats. The fact that Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, the fact that it's the third most populous democracy in the world, the fact that it's the most populous Muslim majority nation in the world. And you might even get into something about strategic geography and how it sits astride the Straits of Malacca. And I think what's actually really important to understand about Indonesia is while foreigners see all these great assets, Indonesians often see these things as vulnerabilities. And so, for instance, it's, big population. They're in the middle of what demographers call a demographic bulge, and they'll need to be able to provide jobs for all these young people who are coming up. And who should be supporting a better social safety net for Indonesia. In terms of geography, they're an archipelago, a lot of islands, very difficult to defend. They see this as a tremendous vulnerability. In terms of their very rich natural resources, and, throughout its history, Indonesia has been foremost concerned that foreign countries, foreign powers, would seek to pull Indonesia apart in order to gain access to those resources. And so its focus on territorial integrity is paramount. And I think these things are poorly understood by many high-profile visitors to Indonesia that see all these things as positives, but don't see the vulnerabilities that Indonesians see.
That's an interesting viewpoint that you talked about this, paranoia is perhaps being unkind, but this acute concern about sovereignty and territoriality. Do you think that's an unfounded concern? Do you think that's overblown, or do you think that's a veritable sense over there?
As a general principle, I don't think it's unfounded. Indonesia has a lot of history. Obama noted in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic earlier this month, he said, we have history in Nicaragua, we have history in Indonesia. And I assume he was talking about the Promesta Rebellion and PRRI. There was a series of events in the 50s where the CIA was effectively bombing Indonesian ports. That's pretty big history. And so, I think that Indonesians have reason to be concerned on principle that about their territorial integrity. But it is sometimes that concern for territorial integrity is allowed to override evidence that some foreign countries may indeed seek a genuine partnership with Indonesia and will not seek to pull Indonesia apart. So Indonesia does have a paranoia when it comes to Papua and what America's intentions are in Papua and what Australia's intentions are in Papua, that I don't think is well-founded, in fact, and is reasonable. But as a general abstract matter, absolutely, I think it's reasonable.
Yeah, no, I think that's something I certainly try and impress as well, that it may not be rational, it may be something very visceral, but it's real and it has to be acknowledged. Look, actually, now that we're talking about territoriality, I think we have to kind of address the big issue that blew up over the weekend. And just to recap for some of our viewers and listeners, there was an Indonesian Maritime Authorities vessel that intercepted a Chinese vessel that was illegally fishing, alleged to be in its territorial waters. Now, that was on Saturday. When the Indonesian authorities were towing the boat back, the boat that was being towed was then rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, and then a second Coast Guard vessel approached the Indonesian authorities and said, "You have 30 minutes to hand over the boat." And that just making clear that the crew had already been arrested by this stage, so it was just about the recapture of the vessel. But all of this seemed to be happening near Indonesian waters, and of course Indonesia under President Jokowi has become a lot more focused on the eradication of illegal fishing, and sovereignty has become a key pillar of his global maritime fulcrum concept. Aaron, if you want to add anything to that, but
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And what's really fascinating about this incident is it really resembles the incidents we saw in 2010, 2011, 2013, where Chinese fisheries law enforcement vessels, which are now part of the Chinese Coast Guard, came down into the very far southern reaches of the South China Sea and attempted to prevent Indonesian fisheries law enforcement vessels from policing their exclusive economic zone. It appears that this Chinese trawler was captured in the very sort of northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone, not in the territorial sea. But what's fascinating about this example is over the course of the following day, Indonesia proceeded to tow that vessel back toward Natuna, and at some point about 24 hours later, or 12 to 24 hours later, it's a little bit unclear, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel caught up with the Indonesian fisheries law enforcement vessel. And that appears to have been, we're still a little bit sketchy on the details, that appears to have been not within Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, but within Indonesia's territorial sea, where the Chinese Coast Guard vessel would have had a right to innocent passage, but ramming a ship to force Indonesian authorities to release it is not innocent passage. And so this really is not just a matter of obscure fishing rights, it is a matter of Indonesia's territorial integrity, which is why I know there's going to be some skepticism that this will change anything in Indonesia because it doesn't want to offend China. But this is why I think that this case is different, and we may see Indonesia shift its South China Sea policy as a result. I don't know, Nat, what do you think?
I think absolutely. I mean, for the reasons I said earlier, Jokowi has put himself in a position where sovereignty is paramount, and if he appears weak on this particular issue, then he is going to appear weak overall. And I think that there are domestic ramifications of that if he doesn't look firm on this particular issue with China. But at the risk of actually making the relationship with China a bit more complicated, and I know that foreign direct investment from China in Indonesia is extremely important for upgrading a lot of the infrastructure. That's just a fact. Japan is also a potential investor as well, but Jokowi has been pursuing FDI with China. So the extent to which he wants to jeopardize that, I think, is the limiting reagent on the extent to which he'll make an issue out of this. But I think he has to. I think he absolutely has to make an issue. What about you? Do you think he's going to say anything?
I don't know if Jokowi will say anything. I think what's happening right now that's really interesting is, and I've just wrote a blog post about this on Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative site. In the background, there has been going on for the last few weeks a review of Indonesia's South China Sea policy, led by Luhut Panjaitan, Indonesia's coordinating minister for politics, law, and security, that is intended to resolve one of the big issues in Indonesian foreign policy, which is the lack of coordination among the various agencies on this particular policy, where the military has been very assertive in saying that it wants to protect Indonesian territorial waters, but the foreign ministry has been much more, I don't know if laid back is the right word, but much more patient with China in terms of asking for an explanation as to what rights China believes it has in Indonesia's EEZ. And so for this incident to come at that moment, when Indonesia's most powerful minister, most influential minister, is considering revising Indonesia's foreign policy on this issue, it must be a tremendous blunder by China. I'm not sure that this was a coordinated action on the part of China, and Linda Jacobson's research suggests that occasionally these things happen in an uncoordinated way. But that really could shift Indonesian foreign policy. Jokowi might not say something, but Luhut Panjaitan, I think, is going to be moved by this.
No, I think that's a good thing. I completely agree with you. There have been statements by military commanders, whether it be Air Force, Navy, or Army, talking about reinforcing the North, particularly around the Natuna Islands, and time again the Foreign Ministry trying to play down and a desire to keep all things cordial. I think this is probably going to provide more alignment for their various positions, for the President's Office, for the Foreign Ministry, and for the military, possibly the Defence Ministry as well, to actually come behind this. I think it's a good thing. I mean, what about beyond that? Do you think there are going to be any other ramifications with Southeast Asian nations watching how Indonesia is going to behave?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Indonesia is primus inter pares within ASEAN, and the other countries, while, maintaining their own foreign policies, they do look to Indonesia and seek to calibrate their foreign policy in relation to where Indonesia is. So if Indonesia is standing back, it's, stepping back, then that makes other ASEAN countries more wary of getting too far out in front of its ASEAN partners. And Indonesia really sort of creates its own balance in that way. So if Indonesia is more forward-leaning on the South China Sea issue, more willing to demonstrate leadership in defense of international norms, then that could affect other ASEAN countries' calculus as well. And so Indonesia really is the big prize in terms of this contest for influence and between competing notions of how the Asia-Pacific region should be run. If Indonesia steps back and only seeks to protect its own narrow interests in the South China Sea, then that really is an advantage for China. But if it takes a leadership role in seeking to bolster international norms that would not only protect Indonesia but also protect its smaller neighbors, then that's really something that China would have to contend with. So it would be a very serious change in the situation.
No, I definitely agree. I definitely think Indonesia should be taking leadership in ASEAN of this particular issue. But I think, you said earlier Indonesia is a prize. I agree with that as well. It seems like Indonesia is almost like the litmus test. If China can kick around the biggest kid on the block, albeit a smaller block, then what does that tell us about, the preparedness of the region? Now, I just want to look at...
I wanted to ask,
go for it.
I wanted to ask you on this because I know you look very carefully at sort of the military movements in the area, and the TNI, the Indonesian military, has sought to upgrade its facilities on the Natuna Islands. But have you noticed, and there's some speculation that this is not really driven by the South China Sea and an interest in protecting Indonesian territory, but perhaps by more economic factors. Where do you stand on that dispute? Do you think it's economically driven, or is it a sovereignty issue for them?
Well, it depends. I think those two issues are interlinked. If you're looking at terms of economics and trade, in terms of protecting Indonesian livelihood locally from illegal fishing, absolutely. If you're talking about making sure there's appropriate military infrastructure there to then support civilian infrastructure growth, making sure you've utilized the military's logistics chains, then yes, again, that there are economic factors there. A less favorable interpretation would see this as the military's push perhaps to gain extra resources and funds for an installation out there. And as unfortunate as it may be, there are some elements of the military that continue to engage in extracurricular activities, fundraising and whatnot, which is obviously a throwback to the old days where funds for the military were raised by themselves and not allocated by the central government. Jokowi is obviously trying to redress that, but my understanding is the amount of money that the central government would need to pour into the TNI would have to be greater than the amount that it extracts from other curricular activities in order to be able to do away with those sort of practices. So there are a couple of factors there to consider.
So just to be clear, because you've been very diplomatic, what we're really talking about is extortion on the high seas, right? The Indonesian Navy goes up to fishing boats and says, you're unlicensed, but we can make you licensed very quickly. Is it that simple, or is it more complex?
Okay, there's a couple of issues, and I'll point to a couple of issues that are reported in the media. There's obviously illegal fuel smuggling is one, and there have been allegations that the Indonesian Navy have been associated with that. And then the Indonesian Maritime Affairs and Fisheries Minister, Susi Pujiastuti, was fuming at the Navy last year. She said, my ministry's navigational sections have shown maps where there have been Chinese fishing vessels in areas that the Navy is meant to patrol. What's going on? So there's a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not the Navy has allowed this to happen. And there are suggestions that when Indonesian authorities are trying to prosecute Chinese-owned companies for illegal fishing, the cases tend to kind of lose steam at the top due to connections with senior military officers. And so these have been well reported in the Jakarta Post, but they are indications of at least untoward behavior in that area. So I would not be surprised that if the push for an expansion of military presence across the archipelago doesn't just have the veil of security, or even there might be veritable security threats, but there might be economic drivers and certainly business drivers as well.
Sure.
Yeah. But look, I just wanted to pick your brains a bit further about what this means for Indonesia. And so we talked a little bit about perhaps a revision of its South China Sea position. What about Indonesia's relationship with other countries in the Indo-Pacific? So do you think this will change Indonesia's relationship perhaps with countries like Japan, India? Do you think it will look to engage the United States more, or do you think it will keep its non-aligned stance?
Well, I probably shouldn't get too far ahead of myself. There's a lot of what-ifs, and there's a lot of conditionality in the prospect that Indonesian South China Sea policy could change. But if Indonesian South China Sea policy were to change, if it were to begin to take a different tack on China's behavior in the region more generally, then yeah, I think you would absolutely see a closer relationship with Japan. Japan's very eager to sell patrol boats to Indonesia. Or I think I'm not actually quite sure if it's selling or if it's donating or if it's financing. But of course, with Japan having revised its defense export guidelines a few years ago, it's in a much freer position to do things like that, and Indonesia would seek to take advantage of that. We haven't actually seen that much cooperation between Indonesia and India over the last few decades, which is interesting because they're very similar countries, right? They're developing democracies with a non-aligned stance in foreign policy that are both concerned about what China's behavior looks like in the region. Perhaps India, under Modi, a little bit more concerned. And my great dream was that Megawati Sukarnoputri would someday win the presidency again, and that there was some speculation in 2014 that if Modi hadn't won a majority in the Lok Sabha, that Mayawati might emerge as a third-party premier in India, and you would have the Megawati-Mayawati summit. That was my great dream for India-Indonesia relations. Unfortunately, neither of them look likely to ever become president of their respective countries again, or leaders of their respective countries again. But we just haven't seen the sort of chemistry between the leaders that we would normally expect to see between India and Indonesia. Indonesia's chairmanship of the Indian Ocean Regional Association, IORA, is perhaps an opportunity to more deeply embed patterns of cooperation between the two. And Indonesia is planning on hosting a summit later this year or next year to commemorate the anniversary of IORA's founding. And that's a very Delhi-centric organization. It doesn't include Pakistan. It does include Iran. It doesn't include Myanmar. So it's really sort of a checkerboard around the Indian Ocean, emanating out from Delhi. So that's perhaps an opportunity for Indonesia and India to work more closely together. But perhaps on the naval side, you have some more insights into the relationship.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I thought about as a result of this issue, and again, I agree with the what-ifs, and is that at least if Indonesia were going to pursue relations with other Indo-Pacific states, it would be more sensible to pursue relations with places like Japan and with India rather than the United States, lest it be accused of appearing like it's turning its back on China. It seems to me like there is a lot of overlap between Indonesia and Japan in terms of HADR, and so that there's potential there that they could join exercises, build a level of familiarity that Japan's Navy enjoys with other navies like the US Navy. But particularly between India and Indonesia, like you said, potential for maritime cooperation, particularly in illegal fishing. I feel like that's a natural overlap of interests, and I think that's something they could share. I do know that some of the difficulties in getting that relationship to move forward have had to do with their bureaucratic systems. So I suppose, if those sorts of things can be ironed out, then we could see more cooperation in that area. I think it would be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And both foreign ministries are known to be not very focused on on each other. I think the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, Greg Feely, pointed out in an article back in January, only has one Hindi speaker, and perhaps you don't really need Hindi to carry on diplomacy with India, but it's a big, important country, and a lot of people do speak Hindi there, and it would probably be good for them to bulk up their focus on India. And on the Indian side, they have a relatively small foreign ministry that's much more focused on the great powers than it is its immediate region. And despite all the representations of Look East and Act East, we haven't really seen that focus on Southeast Asia that India has occasionally promised. So that would certainly be positive. And I like how your argument dovetails with what Rory Medcalf has described as this kind of third-party balancing strategy against China, where it's not actually the U.S. that will be doing the heavy lifting to balance against China, because that also raises fears of containment. But these non-aligned countries could get together. Countries like the quadrilateral that's always been much heralded, but a different quadrilateral, Japan, Australia, India, and Indonesia could get together. And just the last thing I would add on this is people often don't realize just how close India and Indonesia are because of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And Aceh actually goes much further north than people realize. It's well north of KL. And so the EEZs are actually bordering each other, and there is interaction between the fisheries law enforcement vessels. So yeah, absolutely. Working on practical cooperation in the fishing areas in the Andaman Sea would be a great way to start.
Absolutely, I think there's heaps of work for people like us to do in that area. But I was actually going to just tilt a little bit to the east. You talked a little bit about chemistry between leaders. I just want to dig into that a little bit. Of course, we know there's that beautiful bromance between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. Do you think President Obama shares the same kind of level of interest in Southeast Asia, or that level of chemistry with any of the leaders in Southeast Asia?
I think that President Obama identifies, of course he lived in Indonesia for 4 years growing up, and I think he still thinks of himself as coming from that Indonesia of the late 1960s, when Menteng still had the feel of a sleepy village, and Serena was the largest department store in town. And he's talked about it in those terms, in very nostalgic terms. He doesn't seem to have any great affection or familiarity with the Indonesia of today. And indeed, he hadn't been back in decades when he went back in 2010 for his first trip as president. And so I don't know that he really understands Indonesia particularly well. He and SBY, Jokowi's predecessor as president of Indonesia, seemed to have a relatively cold relationship. It didn't seem to be particularly warm. It was workmanlike, but it wasn't warm. And they never really seemed to hit it off. And I think a lot of that has to do with personalities. SBY is very officious. Jokowi's sort of cool and informal. But there should be a better relationship between Jokowi and Obama, because they're much more similar in terms of personality. And it's not clear to me why exactly that personal relationship hasn't taken off in the way that perhaps it could have.
I mean, is there a drive? I mean, obviously there was the pivot strategy, the rebalance strategy that was announced in November 2011, and Hillary Clinton has been emphasizing the importance of ASEAN, the association, the official grouping for Southeast Asia, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, as the fulcrum of the Asia-Pacific region, which we now, in common terms, call the Indo-Pacific as well. Do you still see that interest in Southeast Asia in the current administration? I mean, is Southeast Asia as important as Hillary Clinton made out?
Well, my boss, down the row, Michael Foylove, would say no, and he would give you really personality-based arguments to that effect, and say, Hillary Clinton really was committed to the rebalance. She had people in her administration like Kurt Campbell who were very high energy and who are really writing a very strong engagement policy. And he would argue that John Kerry isn't. And, fair enough, John Kerry's been focused on the Iran nuclear negotiations, on climate change, on other things. But the thing about the American system is it's like an aircraft carrier. And once you start sending it in a particular direction and you build out the institutional framework for engagement, the aircraft carrier tends to continue going in the same direction. It's very difficult to turn the aircraft carrier around. You can maybe blow it up, which is what a Donald Trump presidency would mean for the region. But the aircraft carrier, for the most part, keeps going. And that's really happened with the pivot and with the rebalance. And the institutional frameworks that were put in place when Clinton was Secretary of State are still there. And the people who have been carrying out that agenda perhaps receive too little credit. It's not happening at the John Kerry level anymore, but people at Defense, at DOD, at the Pentagon, are still very engaged. PACOM's very engaged. Danny Russell is maybe more of a quieter operator than Kurt Campbell is, but he's very effective. And so, I actually think that the second term Obama administration has been nearly as effective as the first. It's just a very different job because the level of engagement went up dramatically in the first term, and now the challenge has been to create an expectation of consistency, and that's what the second term has been all about. And I think they've done that quite well.
Yeah, and I think I agree. I think consistency from the perspective of Southeast Asia is extremely important, particularly meeting those expectations. Yes.
Do you think that the United States is meeting those expectations? Are they meeting Australia's expectations of consistency?
I think it's a hard one. I mean, we spend so much time on the region. It's natural for us to invest in those relationships. It's natural for us to see China and the rest of the North through the prism of Southeast Asia. That was sort of told to me the other day, and I really liked that. I think that really resonates with the experience not only of Australian bureaucrats and analysts, but policymakers as well. And so I think for us, we did see the United States prior to the Obama announcement as a little bit detached from Southeast Asia. I mean, despite its long history in places like Vietnam, it just seemed as though that its focus, particularly under Obama's predecessors, was primarily in the Middle East and in Europe. And so we welcomed that. I think we were hard markers in assessing a second-term Obama administration as perhaps not having the same drive and verve in order to get that sort of big, close relationship going between the United States and Southeast Asia. But actually, when you map it out and you say it's about consistency, I think I could be a little bit more willing to concede that there actually has been effort. When I've been in DC and I've spoken to people there, there's enthusiasm for Southeast Asia, there's genuine curiosity, and there are good people working on these sorts of issues. If I'd gone there and found a capital that was rather detached from all these kinds of matters, then I would be more worried. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and that's just anecdotal, but I think that's an important indicator nevertheless. I mean, for instance, I go to Jakarta, and I don't find people particularly interested in Australia. And so when I compare those sorts of levels of personal interest, I think to myself, okay, how much do these countries or these issues play in people's minds? So healthy on the Southeast Asia side in Americans' imagining. But actually now I wouldn't mind sort of shifting gears to talk a little bit about how Southeast Asia sees Australia, because obviously we are also considered a southern anchor in this region. Yeah. Aaron, how long have you been in Australia now?
2 years.
2 years.
2 years yesterday, yeah.
2 years yesterday. Congratulations. Yeah.
Thanks.
Now, from being an outsider, you've had the perspective of sitting in Sydney and watching how we've interacted with Southeast Asia. If you had to give us a scorecard on our foreign policy with Southeast Asia, how would you assess us?
I think Australians are often far too hard on themselves when it comes to their engagement with Indonesia. I'll separate out Indonesia from the rest of the region, from the rest of Southeast Asia. There is a real political demand. Australian political leaders feel as though they have to demonstrate that they have a good relationship with their Indonesian counterpart, and there is a political price to pay when they don't. And Tony Abbott paid that price when he made remarks in February of last year that really damaged the relationship. It's interesting that there's no corresponding pressure on the other side. If SBY or Jokowi ran into troubles with their Australian counterparts, it didn't cost them politically. There was no expectation on the part of all but perhaps the most urbane, sophisticated elite Indonesians who had studied in Australia that they establish a good rapport with their Australian counterpart. So the relationship often seems one-sided as a result. I come to this from an American perspective where Indonesian is not taught in any high school. It's taught at 12 universities around the country, and we have hundreds of pretty good universities. I had to privately finance my own study of Indonesian. There were no scholarships available for me to go and study Indonesian. And so, U.S. government officials end up, are able to study Indonesian on the government dime, but it's more difficult for private citizens. And so, coming to Australia, where there are constantly concerns that and the study of Indonesian is dying in Australia because there are fewer people studying Indonesian today than there were in 1970s. Sometimes a lot of that concern seems overwrought. The top center of study of Indonesian politics in the world is the ANU in Canberra, and that's including universities in Indonesia from my perspective.
Wow.
And you know, I think that that's underappreciated, that the level of expertise and knowledge that exists in Australian universities, the Australian government about Indonesia, and the level of interest is really unparalleled anywhere else in the world. So I am a little bit more relaxed about Australia's engagement with Indonesia. Now, the rest of Southeast Asia is a different story. I sometimes feel as though Australians look north and they see the mountains of Java and Sumbawa and they see Papua, and they can't look much further beyond that first island chain, and they don't see that there's a whole region beyond Indonesia. And so the level of engagement with, say, Malaysia, where there's even a large diaspora in Australia, with Singapore, with Burma, the fact that Burma is the source of many of the region's transnational problems, but there's not very much Australian interest in Burma. I think that should be a cause for concern. There should be much greater Australian focus on mainland Southeast Asia and the other maritime Southeast Asian countries, and perhaps a little bit less on Indonesia.
That's interesting. I actually wouldn't mind talking a little bit about Burma, of course, because that's the other country within Southeast Asia to which you pay a lot of attention. And you've visited Burma recently, haven't you?
Yeah, I was just there 2 months ago.
So now that they're coming to sort of a political transition in Myanmar, in Burma, it's a very interesting point where they now have their first elected government, and Aung San Suu Kyi, unfortunately, won't be the head of that government. I mean, what do you think? To give our listeners and our viewers just a really quick overview of Burma, what do you see when you see Burma? What's key to know?
Sure. So I think the three things to focus on in Burma is obviously the transition to democracy, which is a slow and gradual transition. This is what most of the media and international analysts are focused on. It's how does the military and the NLD, how do they find a way to work together? How do they find a modus vivendi to govern the country? Because they're going to have to do it together. The second one is the insurgencies in the periphery of the country. The reason this is important is just because the periphery of Myanmar is the source of so much of the illicit trade in goods, persons, drugs in Southeast Asia. It's a really sort of lawless area because these insurgencies have gone on for so long, 70 years in some cases. And so Aung San Suu Kyi needs to pick up the baton from the previous government and try to conclude a peace agreement with those militias. Obviously, it won't be easy. That's the reason these conflicts have gone on for so long. But coming to a political agreement that would allow these ethnic armed groups greater influence over their own affairs, but keep the country together and institute law and order in the periphery, that's pretty important. And the third one is just sectarian tensions. And this goes to the fact that Myanmar, Buddhist majority country, has a lot of concern about its demographics. They see Bangladesh next door, which is one of the world's most populous countries and very densely populated. Myanmar's not. And they believe that, some Burmese Buddhists believe that they would be overrun by Bangladeshi migration, or that demographic birth rates would eventually lead to Myanmar becoming a Muslim country. And they say, look what happened to Indonesia centuries ago. Look what happened to Malaysia. They both used to be Buddhist countries. Now they're Muslim countries. And this kind of Islamophobia and this xenophobia is actually pretty common in Myanmar. It's not sort of limited to extremes. And it's frequently stoked by the monks, who also played a big role in the push for democratization. And so the challenge is, how do you get Burma to a more pluralist place, a place that understands that there are people of multiple faiths in Myanmar. And a really positive sign in that respect was the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi nominated a Christian to be one of the two vice presidents in Myanmar. Henry Ventio, he's a Chin. That's a pretty big deal. And I think it sends a message. It wasn't a Muslim. That's maybe too politically challenging for her right now. But it sends a message about pluralism that I think is very important.
That's very interesting. And looking ahead to 2016, there are other changes happening in other Southeast Asian countries. I just want to get your quick take on the Southeast Asian countries to watch for the rest of the year.
Well, I think the things that we're tracking very closely are Vietnam. They had a party congress in January that will lead to a leadership transition later this year. Does that leadership transition mean that Vietnam will continue its relatively tough stance on Chinese territorial ambitions in the South China Sea, or will they resile and take a lighter approach? And they call each other brother nations. Will they take a more brotherly approach towards China as a result of this transition? That could have major ramifications for Southeast Asia going forward. And then the other leadership transition to watch is in the Philippines, where they have an election in early May. Not at all clear who's going to win that election, but only one of the candidates, Grace Poe, would appear to be willing to carry on Noynoy Aquino, President Aquino's record of really staunchly opposing Chinese territorial ambitions in the South China Sea. Other candidates may do it in a little bit less confrontational way, and so that's one to watch as well. There are other leadership transitions that are happening. Myanmar, of course, Laos, which is interesting to watch because it's not so much a U.S.-China competition as it is a Vietnam, Cambodia-China competition. But there are other ones to watch as well. But those are the two that we're tracking that we'll be focused on in our East Asia program at the Institute for the rest of the year.
Wonderful. And obviously, for our last question for today, I always like to ask our guests what kind of music they like to listen to while they research. I just want to get your recommendations for our listeners.
Well, I mean, Nat, you wrote a great blog post for us the other day on the Interpreter. They compared or used old school hip hop to describe Indonesia's approach to Australia's defense white paper. I think I'm maybe more new school than you are, and I think that thinking about Jay-Z's No Church in the Wild, I think describes Southeast Asia fairly well. It's a self-help system. It's sort of the last great. It's the last great resort of the Westphalian system of state sovereignty. There's not a lot of sympathy for things like R2P in Southeast Asia, and so it is the wild, and that's the song that comes to mind, the hip hop song that comes to mind when I think of Southeast Asia.
Fantastic. And for that and more of Aaron's recommendations of how to understand Southeast Asia via New School Hip Hop, as well as all of his wonderful tweets, you can catch Aaron on Twitter at Connelly AL, and of course you can catch all of his latest reports, including one for the Economist Intelligence Unit at www.loweinstitute.org. Aaron, thanks so much again for making time.
Yeah, good to see you, Nat. Nice to talk to you.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.